This is the saga of humanity. In certain times and places in the world, there have been individuals educated enough to revel in the pleasure of using pen and ink. But this pleasure we human beings take as an element of importance. The persistence of many endangered species may very well depend on the fate of a very small number of individual fauna. This is where a brief systematic knowledge of the history of knowledge and a history of everything must in some explicit way historically understood as a history of the world, before, during, and after the phenomena of human history. Given that human existence has only been a wink in the eye in comparison to the existence of planets, stars, galaxies, and the beginnings of our universe, space-time, and everything else, my three previous philosophies has attempted to record and preserve a new philosophy for a more sensible social environment. How could I begin to leave out all the known experiences of our species, and that of all life forms, both of which are extinct but used to persist, and of those which persist but will sometime be extinct? Why would I not? As a philosopher of history and psychology, my theological background was utilized in order to be more empathetic and tolerable to the history of humanity, as opposed to the history of the cosmos, our planet, and the geological and biological histories that could have been written concerning what constitutes their places in space and time. And indeed, as creatures who have eventually developed to think about our thinking, we should also try not to be tempted into not thinking about how we think and why we do so. After all, a more informed individual will better comprehend how the world has changed them into becoming something that changes over time. We not only have civilizations that are existing for brief amounts of time, but also individual beings that last a small fraction or decimal percentage of that time. And so I then began the endeavor to learn all that I could and to be better than before in my learning in order that a more cogent reconstruction concerning the history of the world would commence. The history of the world describes the history of humanity, or human history, as determined by the study of archaeological material, culture, and the eventual use of written records. Ancient recorded history begins with the invention of writing, but the invention of language and the roots of civilization itself reach back into the earliest introductions of primitive technologies and cultures. Prehistory begins in the era of the Paleolithic, the early Stone Age, which is followed by the era of the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, and the agricultural revolution occurring between 8,000 to 5,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent, although we do have other civilizations going back to 10,000, 12,000 years ago. The latter period marks a distinctive change in the 7 million years of hominid evolutionary history, as humans transformed from a nomadic to settled lifestyle and farmers and permanent settlements. The distinctive change we human beings call agriculture is the systematic cultivation and domestication of both fauna and flora. Nomadism continued in some places around the planet that had few species of plants that were not domesticatable, but the relative security and increased productivity provided by farming gave human communities the opportunity to expand into larger units that were spurred on by advancements in transportation. As farming developed its sophistication, there needed to be storage of food between growing seasons, and because of division of labor, there was a leisured upper class and the eventual development of cities. The growing complexity of human societies necessitated systems of writing and accounting for goods. Many cities developed on the banks of lakes and rivers. Well-developed settlements and villages arose in Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, the land between the rivers, on the banks of the Nile River, in the Indus River Valley, and alongside the major rivers of China. This is a quote from Carnap. Carnap lived from 1891 to 1970. Quote, "Given how the world, as it seems to us everyday experience, we develop a construct out of the interpretations our brains make of incoming sensory data and stimulation. And these interpretations are based on theories that constitute what the incoming data might be conveying concerning the entities and events outside of our skulls." End quote. And this is a brief note from the historian and the psychologist of humanity, i.e. myself. The natural sciences, including psychology and the social sciences, philology, archaeology, anthropology, history, etc., have demolished ethics, aesthetics, and religion as they have been traditionally understood, in reductive and falsifying ways, explaining their phenomenological existence in naturalistic, physicalistic, and empirical terms. The outline of the Saga of Humanity can be seen in different scenes, 13 in particular. We have Book 1, Pre-Civilization, which is Humanity Past. We have Scene 1 is the deep and dark beginning. Scene 2 is a collision with the moon. Scene 3 is it as the terrestrial development. Scene 4 is the emergence of the first species. Scene 5 is the arrival of the Jurassic. Scene 6 is the decadence of the Earth. Then we have Book 2, Civilization, Humanity Present. Scene 7, the rise of Mammalia. Scene 8, the glorious saga of humanity, in which I now am writing. Scene 9, the chronological changes of Earth's history. Scene 10, the rest after a hard day's work. And Book 3, Humanity Future, a moment of world peace. Scene 12, Earth reflects upon a past universe. And then Scene 13, a planet consumed by its own sun. This broader Saga of Humanity is a class lecture series and a history and part of a broader work called Knowledge and Time, of which another series, Historio Introductio, I will be giving a lecture on, as well as another lecture titled, it's called Hominin, Homo, Humanoid, but it has a broader title called The New History. And then I have a hermeneutics for the new history. So the fact of understanding is beautiful in a world where individuals are fed by fear, ignorance, prejudice, and lies. Those educated have the power of responsibility to know that which is best for the universe in order to eventually rise up and save humanity from itself. So we will first go into Book 1, which is Pre-Civilization of Humanity Past, Book 2, Civilization of Humanity Present, and then Book 3, which is the untold story, Post-Civilization, Humanity Future. It's a philosophical investigation and a scientific prediction. The Saga of Humanity. As a historian concerned with humanity, past, present, and future, pre-civilization, civilization, and post-civilization, I have considered and identified 7 themes of historical inquiry. One theme in particular is the history of ideas and thoughts, whereby I have sought to show how many societal and economic factors at play have and will inevitably be involved in the process through which many events have and will unfold that led and will lead to cataclysmic movements in the history of ideas, with the chance of also being an important factor in the history of human endeavor in geological and archaeological historical time, given specific geographical terrestrial locations. These factors inevitably exist in an inextricably involved dynamic relationship with changes in the way in which humans perceive the world. And given that the left hemisphere, lacks a sense of lived time, the main movements in modernism are comprehended by a neuropsychological perspective, a catalog of left hemisphere modalities of apprehension. The right hemisphere, however, has a continuous apprehension and appreciation of time and understanding concerning the meaning of human activity. The conclusion is that in order to understand modernism, we investigate the left hemisphere. The Saga of Humanity is divided into different chapters: the prehistoric realm, the ancient realm, the realm of Reformation and Renaissance, the Enlightenment realm, the Romanticism and Industrial realm, the modern and postmodern realms, part 1 and 2, and then the untold realm, which is what part of another lecture called Publius Novia, which is the new public. Chapter 1 emphasizes humanity past, or pre-civilization. Chapter 2 through 6 emphasize humanity present, or civilization, and chapter 7 emphasizes what the future humanity or post-civilization era might be like if humans reach their full possible potential. The first chapters cover 70,000 centuries of human existence. The last chapter attempts to predict what the next 30,000 centuries will be like from a realistic point of view, if that is possible. The story reveals how we have learned so much in a very short span of time, in millions of years. Much of the informational knowledge we human beings have attained spans only 100 centuries in comparison to the earliest chapters, hundreds of thousands of years, and hundreds of thousands of years, which were small in relation to hundreds of millions and billions of years. But these 100 centuries indicate an extensive amount of activity, which constitutes the history of humanity's existence. The undereducated lack sophisticated knowledge and are this way due to internal and external factors in their individualistic experience. I made the case in my philosophical history that people are, for the most part, not able to learn or comprehend time and the history of knowledge in time because they either lack the physiological and/or biological foundational functioning in order to do so, or that they have chosen to shape their experiences of life and reactions in life in such a way as to not be aware of the importance of understanding pertinent information in regard to historical scholarship and the inventions of language and eventually writing systems, the emergence of a historical method and a scientific method, and in the modern world of globalized beings. For the majority of the time that we humans have been on this planet, most of the knowledge that we have acquired or attained has been conventional and utilized for the survival of ourselves. For example, most of what we know from archaeology, see my master's work on historical archaeological approaches and their methodologies, and world prehistory, was unknown to the world of classical antiquity until the long 19th century and beyond. And so I thought to write an inquiry or a history concerning a concrete picture of the world and the beings in it, and a story or history of a futuristic world based upon a deep time understanding of the past, a reconstruction history. Okay, this chapter covers prehistoric art to that of the Greek classical world of antiquity, from about 10,000 BCE to about 1000 CE. So the human as it has been sculpted or painted in portrayal changes beginning in the 6th century BCE, and in particular finds a distinguishable difference around the 4th century onwards in comparison to the earliest prehistoric depictions, which are expressionist and non-individualized, as well as showing an absence of spatial orientation or relationship between parts, repetition or stereotypical abstract patterning, and description of what we know rather than what we see. See Milton Brenner's book, Faces, The Changing Look of Humankind. In the 4th century BCE in Greece, the more abstracted, inexpressive gaze of Egyptian and early Greek representations give way to a portraiture, more individualized, varied in emotional expressions, and emphatically empathetic features and structures. And you can see that in a lot of Minoan art. And this was due in part to a rapid advancement in the functioning of the brain's right hemisphere. In Greek thought and experience, the evolution of a body of highly expressive poetry, rich in metaphor, the idea of the individual as having legitimate claims to be balanced with those of the community at large, and a sense of empathy with others in general, an interest in the natural world, and an ironic appreciation of the pathos of man's position in the world as a, quote, being towards death, end quote. Greek civilization brought into being the codification of laws and analytical philosophy, the formalization of systematic bodies of knowledge. Indeed, these abilities require other abilities, the ability to detach oneself from nature and others that I may objectify. Perhaps this can be clarified by G.W.F. Hegel. Union cannot exist without separation and distinction, but separation and distinction are of no use unless they together form a prelude to a latter union or greater synthesis. The concept of individual in relation to community arises here only in ancient Greece. The frontal lobes of the human brain being distance in space and delay in time, enabling us to see things outside of our bodies, to be observers of a world that we exist in. This development in the history of our species permits a greater capacity to speculate, reflect upon the lessons from the past, and to anticipate or even project possible worlds of the future, to build projects and schemes for the better governing of the state and for the increasement of knowledge of the world at large. This requires the ability to record or to make externalized a huge expansion of the realm of the written word, the development of diagrams, formulas, and maps, records of observations of nature, of records of the history of peoples and of states. Given right hemispheric advances in Greek history, the features of this advance involve two diametrically opposed directions, occurring at the same time, towards a greater abstraction from the world, towards a greater emphatic engagement with the world. So life for the archaic Greek from the 17th century, and then the 5th, 6th, and 5th century changes until Plato, and then the latter period from Plato and beyond. The first comprises of the 7th century, the great Homeric poems, epics rather, and the Iliad and the Odyssey, reached their written form around the second half of the 8th century BCE and are the earliest known works of Western civilization. Notable characteristics include the ability to sustain a unified theme, produce a single whole coherent narrative over a considerable length of time, known for empathy and insight into character as well as a strong sense of noble values at the time of writing. Homeric man does not have a body or a mind. His thought and consciousness are as inseparable a part of his bodily life as our movement and metabolism is to us. The body is indistinguishable from the whole person. Thinking, emotion, awareness, reflection, and will are perceived as the ongoing process of thought, as if it were precisely identified with the palpable inhalation of the breath. So in the 6th century, we have the birth of philosophical inquiry. The starting point was one underlying perception, an intellectual sense of wonder at the sheer fact of existence, and consequently, a conviction that our normal ways of construing the world are profoundly mistaken. In historical hindsight, one could call this an awareness of radical inauthenticity from the achievement of a degree of distance from the world. The most familiar point of commonality in the pre-Socratic philosophies of the pre-Socratic philosophers is the attempt to reconcile, in a sense, the apparent unity of the phenomenal world with its obvious diversity by a common principle from which all things came. The multiplicity of appearances, phenomena being a reflection of the mutability of the primary substance, which underlies everything and could metamorphose between different states. Here we see Herodotus's histories. We see the philosophers of Thales and Anaximander, the first philosopher scientists. At this juncture, I could go into Thales, and I probably will. That Thales was a part of the Milesian school in the early 6th century, who made discoveries in astronomy, including the correct prediction of an eclipse of the sun in 585 BCE, and used his knowledge of mathematics to address problems in the science of engineering. Anaximander, who was Thales' pupil, further posited that all things arise from and ultimately return to a principle that he called the unbounded or the indefinite, apeiron, also unlimited and infinite. Although not accessible to direct perception, the apeiron, or the indefinite, accounted for the phenomenal aspects of the world. Central to the idea is that it must be able to contain within itself, without the mutual annihilation, all opposing principles, including all other conceivable physical elements. In other words, the principle contains all possible, observable, and conceivable physical elements. They were trying to reduce everything that exists into one cause, one thing, one substance. And according to an inescapable logic of things. So we've already talked about Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus was in the 6th century as well. We have archived fragments of them from Ephesus. You have the opulent rival city to the north of the philosophy school in Miletus. Heraclitus, for example, had a poor opinion of the masses, the demos. He had no pupils or followers. He deposited, according to Diogenes, his book as a dedication in the great temple of Artemis, ironically where the general public would not have had access to it. So that's kind of funny. But here we have Heraclitus from fragment 7 and fragment 33. Quote, "He who does not expect will not find out the unexpected, for it is trackless and unexplored. Nature of things are neither hidden nor concealed, but the nature of things do give signs." I'll have another treatise on Heraclitus' insights and ideas, but that is good from now. We have Prometheus, the bringer of numeracy and literacy. So Parmenides in the early 5th century BCE, after the 7th century, in Elea, a Greek colony on the southeastern coast of Italy, he founds his own school of philosophy. And so we'll compare his thoughts to those of Heraclitus and Pythagoras when we go over ancient science, and notice that Zeno was also a pupil of Parmenides. The source, though, is Plato's Dialogues, which I've read all of Plato's Dialogues in his complete works in their entirety. I highly recommend them. Plato's Dialogues, including the Sophists, Parmenides, and Theaetetus. But by the time of Theophrastus, the pupil of Aristotle, writing in the 3rd century BCE, Heraclitus' thought had been replaced. Characteristic of Athens was the cult of Prometheus, the god of technical skill and intelligence, but not wisdom. See the lecture Rise of Greek Drama, Aeschylus' tragedy, play Prometheus Bound, taking to himself the power of the master, the deliverer of humanity. Quote, he says, I roused them to reason and taught them to think, but like forms in dreams, they spent their lives without purpose and confusion, until I showed them how to discern. I invented number and writing, memory, and the muses. End quote. So it is the gradual evolution of greater distance in post-Homeric Greek culture that caused the effervescence of human cognitive ability in the service of both art and science. In Homer's epics, there exists not the word or concept of will, since it develops later in Greek thought. The men of archaic Greece had no will of their own, or concept of a free will, for that matter. For the gods were seen at the implicit level as aligned in some sense to the self, however distant they might have been at the explicit level. Certain sudden thoughts and emotions are seen both at the intervention of personal deities and at the same time as an aspect of independent human psychological development. But what do we know about the Greeks and how they understood the world? Well, many Greek words imply the quality of experience of the one who sees, or the quality of what is seen. The Greeks were making felt distinctions between thought and experience in the world of classical Greece. And here we find the birthplace of philosophy. But most of what we know of Anaximander, for example, came from Aristotle and his pupil Theophrastus. And that quote comes from the fragment of Anaximander. All that remains of his treatise on nature, and it does so only reported by the philosopher Simplicius of Cilicia, writing in 11 centuries later. But he says that when things perish, they return whence they come to be, in accordance with necessity, for they give each other recompense for the injustice according to the ordinance of time. That's Anaximander on nature. For although I see Anaximenes as having taken a retrograde step by concluding with Thales that a physical element could be a candidate for the arche, I grant that from a standpoint of scientific materialism, this could be seen as a step forward, at least that we are back in the realm of empirically testable, and the idea is more reductive in intent. So, continuing on to the ancient realm, we cover Greece and Rome. So indeed, the great humanistic achievements of poetry, drama, sculpture, architecture, empathy, humor, the individual self as it now sensed, the systematic structure of bodies of objective knowledge and products of writing, the development of a legal constitution, a body of laws, philosophy, the invention of ideas of, and the study of history, the formalization of geographical knowledge, the study of maps, cartography, the structure of a system of education, systematic descriptions of human anatomy and physiology, of the other animals in the world, geometry and theories of physics and cosmological astronomy. They all find their origination in Western culture, and in particular that of ancient Greece. So in the late 15th century BCE, Socrates' pupil Plato was born. Plato's written works and dialogues date from the early 4th century BCE and put up Socrates, the wisest man in all of Athens, against all of the many who came to Socrates inquiring after truth. Truth is in principle knowable through reason alone, and that all truths are consistent with one another. Plato's influence on the history of logic, mathematics, and ethical and political philosophy absolutely cannot be overestimated, despite from the fact that his works were lost from view for 1,000 years until the Renaissance. Interestingly, by the time of Socrates, the wisdom of Heracliteanism, the respect for the testimony of the five senses had been abandoned. Instead, the phenomenal world yields only deception. The ideas of things come to be prioritized over the things themselves, over what have direct knowledge of. Plato's doctrine of the eternal forms gives priority to the unchanging categorical type, the ideal, over a myriad of phenomenological exemplars, the things themselves, not the idea of the thing, which in Plato's view are nothing more than imperfect copies of the ideal or idea of its form. Plato's pupil Aristotle was a scientist, given that he has been the most brilliant polymath to have walked the face of our planet. Aristotle was interested in observing and comprehending the natural world of which he was a part of, and was mindful of the pertinence of experience. He reversed Plato's view by finding the universal in and through particular instantiations. The realm of the ancients. Aristotle's spirit did not survive with his works. For 1,500 years, roughly 5th century to 15th century, Aristotle's thoughts concerning experience was considered infallible, since he was also idealized for 700 years in Europe, and till late in the Renaissance, respectively. So it is important to mention here the flexibility of the complexity of Greek language and thought, which inevitably favored abstraction and idealization, i.e. the definite article I learned about in Greek courses was actually invented by the Greeks, and it takes the attribute of an existing thing, and as it is expressed through an adjective, and effectively turns it into an abstracted noun, i.e. kalos, for example, beautiful, to ta kalan, the beautiful. So here I recommend reading Plato's Republic. For in it he says, quote, in an ironic sense, this seems to imply that what is truly and purely conceptual is what is really real, as opposed to what is experienced by, at least by the senses, which becomes only a representation of what is real. And I apologize, that was not from Plato, that was from Snell in The Discovery of the Mind. But anyways, he wrote it in German. The original source is in German. So the absolute can be known by logos, or reason, from the purely phenomenological, an indelible stamp on the history of philosophy for the next subsequent 2,000 years. Concerning the Greek language, how is this applicable to knowing about knowledge, and how can it be reasonably obtained? See Panksepp on Effective Neuroscience, the Foundations of Human and Animal Emotions, on Oxford University Press, 1998. In it he says, quote, language is the only way that we can scientifically bridge the chasm between mind and brain. We should remember that we humans are creatures that can be deceived as easily by logical rigor as by blind faith. End quote. Later on in the ancient world of Greece, truth became something that would need to be proved by argumentation. The importance of metaphor is forgotten. Indeed, what I saw as a tragedy when I read through Plato's complete works was a Socrates/Plato who was torn between his own institutions and the awareness that he is no longer at any length of liberty to trust them. And so told was the tragedy of Plato, the philosopher king of history. But in fact, before moving ahead in time to the Roman kingdom, republic, and empire world, I want to leave you with the words of Plato, who indeed, ambivalent as he is in the Symposium, hints that the realm of the forms abstracts human beings in that it transcends the logical itself, and that those who have intuited the form of the good, agathos, or in the form of the beautiful, kalan, are compelled to pursue and convey them to others in all that is most excellent, and in light of wisdom in the pursuit that virtue can be taught. And this is from Plato's Republic. Quote, some representations definitely harm the minds of their audiences. Representations removed from reality, and easy to produce without any knowledge of the truth of things. No grasp of reality, but merely a superficial representation. The works of artists of all kinds are appealing to an element in us equally far removed from reason, a thoroughly unsound combination. End quote. The importance of the Roman world and its contributions to human civilization. The great legacy of Rome's literature belongs to the Augustan era, the 1st century BCE, with Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Propertius, and Catullus, all writing during a period of 50 years of one another. And there is here an increase in psychological sophistication, insights into human nature, its potential greatness and its failings. This period in Western history experienced the expansion and codification of jurisprudence and the establishment of ideal reasonableness and of what one calls moral rectitude. In the Roman world, we understand the sense of pity for the passing of human lives and achievements, the brevity of life. Sunt lacrymnae verum et rentem mortaria tengunt. And that's Virgil from the Aeneid, line 642. And Virgil wrote in Latin. Okay, so Roman civilization has provided evidence of an advancement towards more well-structured and systematized and organized ways of thinking. Indeed, what was Augustus but the first emperor of Roman Empire, who himself presided over the great flourishing of the arts in its towns and cities, those things which gave character to Roman life and society. Often in the midst of primitive local peoples, many towns were similar in the sense that they faithfully corresponded to a model which hardly changed over time and place. See Les Mémoires de la Méditerranée by Brodel in The Mediterranean in the Ancient World, a 2001 publication. As compared to Greek civilization, which depended on flexibility, imagination, and originality, the Roman civilization's greatness depended on codification of laws, structure, and solidarity. Indeed, this explains Rome's intelligence and genius. It knew that the metropolis could not maintain contact with its empire, provinces, cities, etc., without the legal regulations that were necessarily essential to the maintenance of political, social, and economic order. The body of endless laws would only increase over the ages. Now I give a quote from Freeman in The Closing of the Western Mind, a 2002 publication. By the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire had reached the height of its maturity in that it was relatively peaceful, was able to defend itself, and its high aristocratic elites flourished in an atmosphere of intellectual and spiritual freedom. The domain in which Rome most rapidly developed its own unique personality was architecture. There is a historical truth in the fact that the imperial vastness of Roman-style architecture was made possible only by the invention of Roman concrete. But in historical hindsight, we know that the, quote, everyday life of the average man in the empire, his whole political, economic, and social life was transformed during late antiquity, end quote. See Orange and Hans Peter in Art Forms and Civic Life in the late Roman Empire, a classic study of the relationship between Rome's architecture and the broader values emphasized in this period of human history. This is a quote from that book. It was an increased standardization and equalization of life and humanity. The free and natural forms of the Republic and the early empire, the multiplicity and variation of life under decentralized administration, was replaced by homogeneity and uniformity under an ever-present and increasingly centralized hierarchy of civil officials, where natural growth was regulated into an unchangeable firm order, where individuals were no longer independent in a freely moving harmony with their surroundings, but became an inevitable part of the whole cadre of the state. And so this standardization and equalization are brought about in order to better coordinate society mechanically. And around the time of the 4th century CE, portraiture in stone is unconcerned with its former elusive, mutable, complex world in which we live almost ceases to exist, as if natural objects themselves are absent from human perception. From the Middle Ages onward, the human face and body are symbols where nothing is what it really is in reality. The artist cares only about what the symbols represent. Both myth and metaphor are no longer semi-transparent, but an opaque shell of lies, which enclose the real truth, an abstraction and nothing more. Therefore, loss is found in concerning the sense of the symmetrical beauty of proportion and size, irrelevant insofar as the Middle Ages are concerned in Western history. And in the domains of painting and sculpture, Roman art slowly distinguished itself from earlier Greek models. My description of the transitory period between civilization of ancient times and civilization of medieval times exhibits the mobile towards the static, from the dialectic and relative towards the dogmatic and the authoritarian, from the empirical towards religiosity, in the form of theology and theosophy. The first being the study of the nature of the divine, religious ideas and practices. The second being a religious theory based on mystical insight. But this is not to be confused with theory, a general principle formulated to account for a certain observable phenomena. Hypothesis and thesis. So this transition between the Roman world and the Middle Ages in which Christendom reigned is not local, where a more vibrant and tolerant culture might have prevailed, but widespread, an intolerant culture, focused on abstractions and conformity as opposed to natural individual freedom. And indeed, it was a consequence of the rise of Christian religion. After Milan in 313 CE, due to Constantine's continuous efforts in the 4th century to begin the process of integrating the church into the state, and in doing so prompted and promoted its identification with military victory, with secular power, and wealth. In 381, the Nicene Decree of Theodosius outlawed paganism. Being apart from the Abrahamic faiths, the ancient Greek world of tolerance of others' beliefs, an inclusive attitude towards all the gods, became a world less accommodating of difference, and therefore independence, but more concerned with religious dogma as opposed to reason. And by the end of the 4th century, such experienced tolerance was now a part of the past, buried in the passage of time. Contrast between the rich and wonderful tradition of the early church fathers and the rich and wonderful paganism with which it coexisted, and a culture marked by a concern with legalistic abstractions, correctness, and dogmatic certainties, whether Roman or Greek or Christian, which inexorably replaced what once was. And as you know, what is once is. What was once is. So, for the Greeks, spiritually and rationally, and logos could exist comfortably without conflict. But the idea that spirituality and rationality could be brought together in written form and then interpreted to make statements of truth, or logoi, was a foreign concept to the Greeks before the rise of Christendom. And contrary to popular belief, reason was not lost during the late antiquity and the Middle Ages, for at the time there was not a moment when the world of Eurasia ceased to positively overflow with intellectual and rational argumentation. The only difference is that this period placed an emphasis on a framework for divinity rather than a framework on the movement of the planetary spheres. So great historians, philosophers, scientists would do well in imitating aspects of Aristotle and developing an openness to the provisional nature of knowledge, but we need not make him an authority, which removes the need to inquire further into the phenomenal world, but an inspiration to think for oneself. Greek intellectual life centered on the tolerance of opposition and independence of human thought, not the suppression of the many thoughts of men and persons. Through the empire survived in a particular form in the eastern parts of Europe, in the Byzantine places, the Western Empire was destroyed. Fiscal decline, with its consequences for army underfunded by taxation, led to civil wars which undermined resources, its ultimate feat at the hands of barbarians, non-Greek speaking peoples, resulting in a catastrophic collapse of civilization. And I get that from Ward Perkins in his The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, a 2005 publication. Between 500 CE and 1100 CE, about a period of 600 years, the conditions of what barely existed before, i.e. intellectual life, was no longer obtained and sustained, leading to a loss of the knowledge of Greek as well as the little mathematical scientific advancement. For it was not until the 10th century that preserved Arabic translations of Greek texts flowed eventually back into the European consciousness. Learning, in a general sense, revived largely due to the church, which preserved and copied texts, encouraged learning, and whose scholars and scribes were open to both Greek and non-Greek Arab ideas that constituted classical culture. Here, I'm going to go into the late medieval world. I will then end this video, and I will pick back up about the Renaissance. We will go into the Renaissance realm, and then we'll go into the Enlightenment realm, and then we'll go into the modern and postmodernistic realms, and then we'll go to the future. So bear with me. We're almost done with this video. Late medieval world. Ideas and movements. Medieval thinking. The establishment of the first universities in the Middle Age. This is extremely important. It was a time of learning. It was a time of knowledge dissemination. It was a time of recorded history. And indeed, the Italian humanists of the 14th to 15th centuries invented what's called the saeculum obscurum, i.e. dark age, to separate their history from the fall of the Roman Empire. The dawn of the 6th century, Anno Domini, AD, means in the year of our Lord. And that came from Bede, the Immaculate Bede, the historian, and of the Middle Ages, and at the time of their present place and time. And so, contrary to what they had mythologized, the medieval Middle Age was a time of knowledge and discovery, but the only known dark age in the global history of mankind outside of prehistory occurred around 1000 BC with the event of the Sea Peoples and the Scythians, who attacked vast amounts of civilizations in the Middle East, including the Hittites, the New Kingdom of Egypt. But learning and innovation was further in the Middle Ages, including the first established universities in Italy in 1088. The first university at Padua, or not Padua, but Bologna, was instituted in 1088, the 11th century in Italy. Universitas, were instrumental in regard to the establishment of canon law, which dictated what the church could not do within the boundaries of Western Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. The Western universities were a place for the establishment of canon law for lawyers, used by the popes and bishops to establish legal precedents for their goals and actions. This was the original function of the university, but soon it changed to incorporate each and every form of all possible learning through schools. Among medieval thinking was a tendency towards an accumulation of knowledge, expansion of knowledge, the codifying of said knowledge, discovering different ways in which to explain all knowledge, and out of this endeavor came scholasticism, the first major movement among the ranks of the first universities. But scholasticism's goal was to establish all learning and knowledge under the realm of theology, i.e. all other arts and sciences came from theology. So see St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica for theology. Okay, so Luther was a product of what came out of the Middle Ages. He taught as a professor at the University of Wittenberg. He was an accomplished scholar in Greek and Latin, and he was a German. So enter the advent of printing, and the encyclopedia is similar to the advent of internet in the modern age. The Gutenberg press in the Middle Ages, a moment of phenomenal change in the extent to which it could be used. Both reading and printing were crucial to the advancement of teaching throughout the dawn of the 16th and beyond. In fact, urban cities, only 15% of people could read or write, and in rural areas, only 5% of people could read. And then a smaller portion of this people could write. And I'm going to have another lecture on literacy, the history of developed literacy throughout human civilization in another video. But during the 16th century and beyond, there was a shift to only Latin being used by scholars at the universities, while printing allowed for better translations of publications in the vernacular language, considering the spreading of knowledge and truth in unity. Corpus Christianum. Reformers were also known as humanists. In other words, they cared about humanity. You have Erasmian humanism, which is a lot different from a secular humanism, however. But learning text and sources, ancient writers, the truth spoken and written in the annals of time, the Renaissance or rebirth would ultimately spring from the aftermath of the Reformations that occurred throughout Europe. Nominalism and natural philosophy also emerged from scholasticism, but truth in the Middle Age and early modern Europe was not relative. It was extremely objective because of theological reasons. That is the end of the first book. I then will enter into the second book, chapter 3, and this will cover the Renaissance realm, and then go on into the Enlightenment realm. Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeking to want to learn. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed the video. See you in the next one.